On April 24, 2023, the United Nations announced that India would overtake China as the world's most populous country by the end of April. It's the first time since 1950 that China has fallen to second place in the global population rankings.
India is projected to overtake China as the world's most populous country during the current month, April of 2023. China's population reached its peak size of 1.4 million in 2022 and has begun to decline. Projections indicate that the size of the Chinese population could drop below 1 billion before the end of the century. In India, by contrast, the population is expected to continue growing for several decades.
This is one of the most significant changes in global demographics. For the first time since the United Nations started recording the global population in 1950, China loses its position as the most populous country. In the last decade, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has often used India in its official propaganda to arouse the sentiment of love for the party. Many Chinese are led to believe that India's independence was around the same time as the founding of the People's Republic of China. Both are populous countries, but India's economy is backward and the gap in economic development between the two countries is huge, suggesting that the Communist Party's authoritarian system is superior to democratic rule in India. Now is a tipping point. India's population has officially surpassed that of China, making it the most populous country in the world. Its economy is growing rapidly and is poised to catch up with China. It has made China the world's factory status even more fragile. The process of decoupling with the CCP and restructuring the world economic chain is accelerating. India's position in the United Nations is expected to be more dynamic and vocal. While it impacts the global political and economic landscape, it'll also bring challenges for the CCP in terms of economic recovery and regional conflicts. The influence is multifaceted to the extent that a declining population will lead to a decline in military numbers. There have always been border conflicts between China and India, and the rise and fall of battling power between the two will change as well. There is no doubt that China's so-called scholars and experts are feeling sour, which is evident in what's published in its official media.
This, we call it, if you call it a great cross. However, it is predicted 20 or 30 years ago, and we already know there will be the situation. I think in the future, we also need to identify new demographic windows and opportunities. For example, as people talking about second demographic dividend, when in the aging population, we have to have certain institutional and policy reform to catch the new opportunity. For example, the postponement of retirement and pension reform, I think it is very important.
Let's first look at India at this turning point and then discuss China in the second half of the episode. In 2022, the average age in India was 28.7 years, with 63.6% of the population aged 15 to 64. The median age was 27 years old, 11 years younger than the median age of 38 years in China. The number of people under the age of 18 in India is 1/3 of the total population, compared to 1/5 in China. India will continue to have a massive young population for the next 20 years. Such a demographic dividend is highly favorable. It has contributed to the prosperity of China's manufacturing industry. With a young population, India has a considerable advantage in the global labor market. According to an American scholar, India will become the world's largest pool of talent. Experts caution that India needs to invest more in education and employment to seize the opportunities presented by its young population in the coming decades. India's actual GDP growth of 6.7% in 2022 is higher than China's 3%, making it the fifth largest economy in the world. Its GDP in 2021 was 8.7%, surpassing China's for the second consecutive year. Many international institutions believe that India's economy will be more dynamic in 2023. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, forecasts that India's economy will grow at a rate of 6.1% in 2023 and 6.8% in 2024. According to a study by the Reserve Bank of India, India's growth rate of 6% or more is expected, and it'll surpass that of Germany in 2025 or 2026 and Japan in 2027, becoming the third largest economy in the world. Contrary to China's export-dependent economy, India's economy is driven mainly by domestic consumption. Its GDP is composed of a much higher proportion of consumer spending than that of China, with individual consumption accounting for 67% of GDP, higher than that of any other Asian country. In 2022, China's domestic spending contributed only 32.8% to the country's GDP. India's growth in the service industry is rapid, and its economic development model is completely different from China's export-led, investment-driven, and urbanization-driven approach to industrialization. India's economic development model is service-oriented and domestic demand-driven, moving directly from an agrarian society to a post-industrial society. Compared to China, India has a large English-speaking population and a fast start in the technology industry. The country's 250 million people who are proficient in speaking English allow India to skip the industrialization process and move directly into a service-oriented tertiary sector economy. India's service sector now accounts for nearly 60% of GDP and is the world's second largest exporter of software and the world's largest provider of offshore services. Bengaluru, now known as India's Silicon Valley, is home to 400 global R&D centers. According to the world's professional organization, CMM, nearly 30 of the world's top 75 software companies are located in Bengaluru. It is home to 4,500 high-tech companies. It has become the fifth largest IT center in the world and is considered by IT professionals to have the power to challenge Silicon Valley. India's manufacturing industry is relatively less developed, but that is now changing as China's economic downturn and political risks have deterred foreign investors. The manufacturing industry chain is leaving China and forming a framework for economic development in South and Southeast Asia, with India and Vietnam as the leaders, creating an industrial chain that will replace China as the world's factory. Let's look at Apple. Apple, like Tesla, will likely be one of the last multinational companies to pull out of China. Apple CEO Tim Cook arrived in China in late March and was met privately by senior Chinese officials. Despite being one of the U.S. tech giants close to the CCP, Cook is not so foolish to lose sight of the situation. According to Bloomberg, even though Cook has befriended Beijing, Apple executives are still working hard to reduce their dependence on the CCP by expanding beyond China. India may become the center of Apple's industrial chain in Asia. This was a scene from April 20th, 2023. Tim Cook met enthusiastic fans as he inaugurated New Delhi's retail store 2 days after opening its first outlet in Mumbai, the commercial capital.
बहुत लॉयल कस्टमर है एप्पल के। ये पहला प्रोडक्ट था और ये अभी लेटेस्ट प्रोडक्ट है एप्पल का जो खरीदा है, तो एक कल्ट फॉलोइंग है एप्पल की। नहीं दिखाता है कि एप्पल का जो प्रायोरिटी है वो इंडिया की तरफ है और मैन्युफैक्चरिंग भी बढ़ती जा रही है, साथ में रिटेल प्रेजेंस भी बढ़ रहा है, तो I mean, it is good to be prioritized.
The U.S. tech giant could double or triple investments in India along with exports over the next few years, an Indian minister said following a meeting on April 19th with Cook. The shift in Apple orders has most directly affected Foxconn's factories in China. The Chinese media, Yitai, reported that the number of employees at Foxconn's Zhengzhou campus is half of what it was a year ago. And the Zhengzhou municipal government is trying to shake off its dependence on Foxconn by bringing in major factories such as BYD. This is a Foxconn factory in Shenzhen. What you see now are employees getting off work. Almost all of them are full-time employees, and there are no more temporary workers. In April, many of us in the IPBG business group received a notice from the supervisor to work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. Wages are paid on the 7th of each month. After deducting the social insurance, provident fund, food, and accommodation, the pay is less than the base salary. So in April, we are going to just live on pretty much nothing. But the overall situation is nonetheless better than the people outside who have no jobs. In previous years, IPBG employees were very busy at this time of year. They had to work at least 60 hours of overtime per week, especially when it comes to Apple's new product launch, which happens every year in September and October. Our IPBG division does the first half of Apple's cell phone, and we will be busy first. When we finish the product, IDPBG will take over and finish it. They assemble the finished phone. But by April, our division still hasn't added shifts. It must have a lot to do with the general environment. Surely it must be that Apple hasn't placed enough orders. It is possible that Apple orders are partly transferred to foreign countries such as Vietnam and India. Good morning, everyone. I'm working in Shenzhen, Foxconn. I have to confess, it's a little panicky to see the traffic in Foxconn on Saturday. It would be a lie to say that there is no panic in my heart. Because if Foxconn moves overseas, I will become unemployed. I joined Foxconn upon graduation. If Foxconn moves away, I really don't know where to look for a job. Some people think they can just find another job in a factory. But to be honest, it's really not easy to find a factory that offers such benefits as Foxconn. In 2022, India announced its intention to invest about $9.2 billion to create a new era for India's electronics manufacturing industry. At this tipping point concerning the rise and fall of national power between China and India, the CCP's propaganda department won't mention the demographic dividend, but rather focuses on the so-called talent dividend, claiming that India's demographic dividend could turn into a demographic catastrophe. In reality, the CCP relied on a cruel family planning campaign that trampled on human rights when it needed to control the population boom. The Indian government has, however, long advocated and encouraged fertility reduction through various other means. As such, its fertility rate has been brought down to 2.05, below the replacement level by 2020. Among its 22 states and union territories, 17 already have fertility rates below 2.0, so India isn't experiencing a catastrophic population explosion.
Our median projection indicates that India's population could stop growing around 2064 and stabilize thereafter. But there is some uncertainty around that projection, and so while we project that the population of India will be around 1.5 billion at the end of the century, in the medium variant, the 95% uncertainty intervals that we have estimated around that median projection range from a low of 1 billion to a high as over 2 billion.
We say that the population is exploding. We have to understand that the population is increasing because people are living longer. So in 1950, people average age of expectancy of life was around 50, but now it is around 72, which may go up to 77. So the focus of our journey should be to create a healthy population.
Now let's look at China. Chinese scholars have argued for the CCP that China's economic growth is not only due to the demographic dividend, but also to its institutional advantages in the degree of reform and opening up. However, we believe the demographic bonus is the main driver of China's economic growth. Without the cheap labor force as capital, all other factors contributing to China's export-oriented growth and foreign investment would have collapsed quickly. Therefore, when China's demographic bonus disappeared, a panic set in within the Communist Party. At the end of March, China's Ministry of Education announced that there were 17 million students in regular elementary schools in 2022. Compared to 2012, the number of elementary schools dropped by 79,500 in 10 years, a 35% decrease. This is an indication of the declining birth rate in China. According to figures from the Chinese government, the number of births has been declining rapidly since 2017. For example, the number of births dropped from 17.23 million in 2017 to 9.56 million in 2022. Keep in mind that these figures published by the CCP are typically reworked. According to Reuters, online searches for baby carriages on China's Baidu search engine fell 17% in 2022 and 41% since 2018. But searches for nursing homes spiked 8-fold in 2022. As the situation of dropping birth rate and the aging population worsens, the working age population is also declining from 70.1% to 63.4% between 2010 and 2020. The CCP has introduced policies in the last few years to encourage women to have more babies, but these have done little to the population growth. Data shows that China's economic growth over the decades has benefited from a demographic dividend. In the 32 years from 1978 to 2010, the annual economic growth rate was 10.1%, except for 1989 and 1990, when it was affected by the June 4th Tiananmen student movement, when it was 4.2% and 3.9%. It was basically a high-speed growth period. In 2008, despite the financial turmoil, China's economy still had a high growth rate of 9.7%. However, China's GDP has been declining every year from 10.6% in 2010 to 3% in 2022. China's working population ratio declined for the first time in a decade in 2011. The share of the working age population aged 15 to 64 was 74.4%, a slight decrease of 0.1 percentage points from 2010, and has been on a downward trend ever since. The Communist Party now claims that China's labor force is highly educated and has a significant talent dividend, but the current employment in China is so bad that the higher the education level, the higher the unemployment rate. For many college students, graduation means unemployment. Those young people who are swept by the tide of unemployment have been making videos to tell their friends that they are joining the trendy wave right now.
是的，我被裁员了。
Yes, I was laid off. I was notified on Monday, and by this time I already wrapped up and came home. At that time, my supervisor came to talk to me with tears in his eyes, and I asked him what was wrong. Are you leaving the company? He said, no, you're leaving. Previously, the company's elevator was broken, and it would take a month to fix. I had no idea that I wouldn't be able to see it fixed. Many of my friends who knew this asked me, how do you feel? I don't have any special feelings, because in this period, if you are laid off, it's like being trendy.
这年头，你说你被裁员，好像真赶了个时髦一样。
Now the CCP has a headache because it can no longer use the example of India to demonstrate its institutional advantage. In 2022, India held a presidential election with a voter turnout of 99.12%. The CCP doesn't allow direct elections of one person, one vote. One of its excuses is that the public is too poorly educated. Now Chinese people will see that the Indians who have been degraded by the CCP as less qualified are now catching up economically using one person, one vote, democratic elections in an ethnically and religiously diverse country. In today's India-China border conflict, the Modi government has been strong and assertive. Since taking office in 2014, the Modi government has invested millions of dollars to strengthen the long border with China, which stretches some 3,800 kilometers, and to upgrade military and civilian infrastructure. Prior to that, relations between the two countries remained tense following a bloody clash in the Western Himalayas in 2020, in which 24 soldiers were killed, and again in Tawang Abong in December 2022. The Modi government is cautious of the CCP as evidenced by its recent oil deal. Last year, India's largest cement producer, Ultratech Cement, bought a shipment of Russian coal in Chinese currency renminbi, raising concerns among its officials. According to oil traders in Reuters calculations, India and China have snapped up the vast majority of Russian oil exports so far in April at a price higher than the $60 per barrel ceiling set by the US and European countries. 3 Indian officials involved in the government policy and 2 insiders in the banking sector told Reuters that India has asked banks and traders to avoid using the Chinese currency renminbi to pay for imports from Russia because of long-standing political differences with the CCP. 2 bank officials with knowledge of the matter said the Reserve Bank of India isn't keen on using the renminbi for foreign trade settlements and confirmed that the Indian government doesn't want them to use the Chinese yuan. This shows that India has become part of the alliance to contain the CCP. Relations between India and the US and Europe are heating up fast. The US would like to see the rise of a strong India in South Asia. A strong India, coupled with its friendly relations with Japan, the recent reconciliation between Japan and Korea, and the rapid shift of the world economic chain away from China, is consistent with the US desire to dominate Indo-Pacific geopolitics. The U.S. also sees that the core of future global economic development is the Indo-Pacific region, from East Asia to Southeast Asia to South Asia, a region with a population of 3.5 billion people, accounting for half of the world, and a region that's fast-growing. So India definitely plays a significant role in the region. There is no denying that China's economic development has far surpassed India's over the past 30 years. But the national development is like a marathon rather than a 100-meter sprint, and India is catching up. As India's economic strength grows, its position in international politics continues to rise. For example, in 2022, India has become chair of the G20 summit for the first time and has become a buffer and balancing factor between the West and Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. India's position in Indo-Pacific geopolitics continues to rise. Fundamentally, it's the incompatible national system and democratic value system between India and the CCP that has made India's growth the most difficult thing for the CCP to swallow.